The microphone so I don't forget. Hopefully this is working.
Okay, so did you want to keep these?
Do I want to keep what?
I saw the rest of them.
Oh my Lanta, reset this. That's fine. Is it working now?
There you go.
Okay, all right. Now we're cooking with gas. I hope so.
We just wanted
They're going to take away your gas.
There is no class in seminary on this, so there's nothing. There probably should be, but there's
You just
no
need to train your son.
class.
Right.
Man, yeah, that'd be great, wouldn't it?
He'll come and do it for you.
Okay. So I have, as you see, I have 20 slides tonight, so there's a lot to cover, and we're gonna hop in, or we're gonna go. So if y'all are with me, we're good. I promise we're gonna pray. Don't let me forget to pray, but we'll get there. Okay. I'm doing good at these short summaries. I'm making them choppy. So I've chopped them up even more, made them really tight as I can. So a short summary so far. If you've missed, that's okay. Mark 1, John the Baptist and Jesus baptized, tempted and calls disciples. Mark 2, Jesus heals and debates. Right? Mark 3, Jesus heals and debates and appoints 12. Mark 4, Jesus teaches in parables and calms the storm. I could probably remove that prepositional phrase and just say Jesus teaches and calms the storm. See? I'll do that next week. We'll get it nice and tight. It'll be good. All right. There have been some lingering difficulties in our conversations. That has been somewhat intentional. We've already discussed some of those. And my goal is to come back around to these over and over again. And, what I want to do is I want you to feel the tension before we address the tension. And that way we can really have it memorable for us. So before we begin with some lingering difficulties on what we've been talking about and hop into Mark 5, let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we are grateful for the day that you have given us today. We're grateful for this space and gathering here, both online and in person, and walking through the Gospel of Mark together. I pray that you would be in our conversation, that you would strengthen us in our faith, that you would embolden us in our questions as we wrestle with Mark and as Mark wrestles with us. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, we have talked a lot about Mark so far, and I have not avoided some things, but I've, again, wanted you to feel the tension in some of these things. So I want to talk very clearly, and I'm going to try succinctly, but more importantly, accurately, about 3 questions. I'm going to talk about textual criticism about Mark. And I know some of you may not know what that means. We're going to hop into it, I promise. I think it's fascinating. But if I talk for like 20 minutes about it, you'll fall asleep. So I'm going to talk for like 5 minutes about it. Okay. The second is, who is the author of Mark? Please answer the question as best we can. You're probably going to get frustrated, but we're going to go as far as we can and why we can. And the last one is, when can we date Mark's writing? I wanted to say, when can we date Mark? But then I didn't feel like that was an appropriate question. So I had to add that. All right. So there is this thing called textual criticism. And I think it's really interesting. It has to do with how we get this thing that we call the Bible. I'm going to say some things that you've heard me say before, you all know. It's going to refresh our memory. Number 1, the Bible was not written in English. Nod your head, right? Good, we're doing good. All right, so the King James Version you and I grew up on, New King James, RSV, NIV, NLT, ESV, ABCD, EFG, doesn't matter. None of those were what the Bible was written in. Nod your head. You know this. Okay. Also, the Bible, when I say those words, we often think of a book. Remember, that's a relatively modern invention. So when you and I say the Bible, we think of the book that Grandma gave us and it sits on the bedside table, right? That's what we think of. Now the early Christians, when they say the word Bible, 1, that word didn't really exist. That's weird. 2, they ain't got no books. They don't exist. They do not exist. You cannot go down to the Greenwood Public Library and check out books. They don't exist. They had libraries. Nod your head. They had libraries, but they were depositories of scrolls and fragments of information. You with me? Okay, so here are codices. These are not books, the way that you and I think of them. They are written on papyrus or vellum. Papyrus are reeds, right, that would grow up along the riverbanks, and they would compress them together and be able to write on them. They're like paper, but way rougher, not. Or they're written on vellum, which is animal skin. So, these are some of the oldest codices we have. It's called the most extant codices we have. So the Codex Vaticanus, one guess as to where that's housed? At the Vatican, right? And it's dated between 325 and 350 AD. That's an old book. And I use that term generously, right? It's not accurate. That's an old codex. It's, 1700 some odd years old. And interestingly enough, the Codex Vaticanus is the entire Bible. Now, when I say the word Bible, I mean the books of the Bible. So it's all of them. Genesis through Revelation, plus some extras, right? But it's all of them. So it's all of them. We have older manuscripts. And a pause. So when we're talking about when was Mark written, if Mark was written in, I'm going to tell you the answer, anytime between 65 and 75 AD, if Mark was written then Codex Vaticanus is only, let's say, 300 years removed from the original writing of Mark. When we're talking about 2023, that's pretty close in terms of transmission of information. I about brought something tonight and I forgot. I'll bring it next week. I have some really old books at home. I think they're fascinating to look through. And I have one book that is a trilogy of The Lord of the Rings. And in the very beginning, it talks about differences in the text between Tolkien's manuscripts. Like the spelling of dwarfs and dwarves with a V. Like even he fluctuated. And so there's all this textual criticism about, well, what did he mean? What was this supposed to be? And it's like, so if you go all the way back, you would say, well, if we can read Mark and Codex Vaticanus, we would have a pretty close idea to what the original text was. Now, again, we have text older than that, but they're only fragments. And those are on papyrus. So I'm going to follow some of my notes to make sure I get my talking points, and we'll walk through some of these. It's interesting. I promise I won't go too long, because I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. I'll do my best. So the Codex Vaticanus is the 4th century manuscript of a Greek Bible. That means the Old Testament is not in Hebrew, but it's written in Greek. It's been already translated, right? So it's one step removed from its original language. It contains the majority of the Greek Old Testament and the majority of the Greek New Testament, and it's one of the 4 great uncial codices. These are the other 2, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Alexandrinus. This one, this Codex Alexandrinus, this is the table of contents for the Gospel of Mark.
Wow.
It's over 1,600 some odd years old. And it's right there. You'll notice a couple other things, specifically this zoomed in portion of the Codex Sinaiticus. You'll notice, I don't know if you can see this, that those are all capital letters. And so all the codices of this time, it was written in what's called scriptum continuum. That means it's all written without any spaces. Things like punctuation, quotation marks, these things don't exist. So when you read John chapter 3, verse 16, it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life." Some Bibles will put quotations around that and write it in red and say, Jesus said that. And I'm going to tell you, that ain't in the codexes. We don't, that's an editorial decision. It might be a true one, it might be accurate, but it's not in the originals. Because they were all written without punctuation, without any sort of spacing, and there was no red ink to say these are the red letter words of Jesus. So those are inferences made based off of context. You'll also notice from this Codex Sinaiticus that there's some really small print down here. It's a footnote. I'm going to say it again. It's a footnote. That means like in 300 AD, as monks were writing, there might have already been textual variants or things that they were understanding.
Or not.
Ah.
And so when we get to Mark chapter 16, oh boy, some people, it gets kind of crazy. There are kind of two endings to the Gospel of Mark. Some people are going to say Mark 16 is the real ending. Some people are going to say, no, that was added later, and Mark 15 is the real ending. And then the scholar is going to get all in a tizzy and say, well, Codex Vaticanus doesn't include 16. But Codex Alexandrinus does. So which one's right? I don't know. All right? So we've talked about the text. We've talked about codices. There are 4 that are the oldest full copies of the Bible. So if you are ever in vacation in Paris, you can check one out there. It resides in the National Library of France. It's the oldest full manuscript of the Bible we have in Greek. There's 2 in the British Library in London, and then 1 in the Vatican. Oh, that's pretty interesting. There's only 4. So, some more notes. I've already talked about Mark 16. We have less copies of Mark than any other gospel. That means the church really liked the Gospel of John, and they copied it a lot, and they rotated it around a lot. But they didn't copy Mark a whole lot. We have less copies of Mark. There are only 118 extant, means existing, New Testament fragments of the Gospel of Mark. So we only have 118. That predates this 325 figure. So we have 118 scraps of the Gospel of Mark that are super close to the original authorship. Of those 118, Mark, the Gospel, is really only present in large portions in 3 of them. So we've got some small amounts of data. And then, we've talked about that already. Okay. The last thing I need to talk about is Mark used as a source. So we talked about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 Gospels. Nod your head, you're with me. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we talked about Mark being the earliest. And then we talked about how Matthew and Luke probably use Mark's material. And then sometimes Matthew and Luke agree on something. They say it the same way. And then it's different than Mark. So people will talk about this idea that there's also another source material that might be a different edition of Mark. You know, Mark edition, 2nd edition. You got the 2nd edition book, I got the 1st edition. Which one's more accurate, right? And those were circulating around in the early church. Okay. Any questions about textual stuff? I'm happy to sit for a second. I know if I talk too much more, we're just going to fall asleep. I'm with you. I'm going to do it due diligence.
Well, but these old Jews sat and figured out what books should be in their Bible, who figured out what should all be in our Bible. Is that the same Jews?
No. It is, that is a massive question, a really good question, and I'll recommend one book. I don't remember the title, but Adam Hamilton has a book called Understanding the Bible, like how it came to be, things like that. He's a Methodist pastor. It's a good book, and it talks about that a little bit. There are, of course, some other books that talk about how the Bible came to be. That is a 10-week class, easy. It's good. Yes?
On that, in 325, did Constantine have a lot of influence?
Sorry. I'm going to just say yes. I'm going to say the answer is yes. So the reason why I giggled like a little schoolgirl is because we will remember with great historical clarity that to be a Christian in the Roman Empire was a naughty thing, right? You were considered a pagan. It was bad. You were generally persecuted. Sometimes, depending on who was emperor, you were fed to a lion, right, or lit on fire. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. It's bad, naughty, very bad. Later, in the 300s-ish, Constantine becomes emperor, and he has a vested interest in uniting his kingdom. And One of the reasons is because of this upstart religion that's burning through everything like wildfire called Christianity. And so it no longer becomes illegal, and it becomes the state religion of Rome. And that's complicated.
Wow.
Yeah. The Council of Nicaea,
Yeah.
Emperor Constantine is welcomed. And the Council of Nicaea is a pretty big deal. We've got a whole entire creed about it. There are lots of books written about that topic. It's very interesting. Questions? Doing okay? All right. You can just drill down on the Wikipedia article and just get lost for days. All right, so who is the author of Mark? I'm going to just walk down my bullet points real quick so we can just move on with our lives. We'll do okay, right? I'm going to just begin by summary. I love that. It don't matter. You know, like we got Mark, it's in the Bible, so I don't care who wrote it because it's here. And so we might as well talk about it. Of course, scholars will go, oh, Josh, how dare you? That's so dismissive.
It's Mark.
But, you know. So no one named Mark appears in the text. I encourage you to read all of Mark. You're not going to find anyone named Mark. It's not there. Mark is a title, appears on all the manuscripts. I'm going to go back. Right? So the name Mark is here. It's in Scripture. It's there. But it's not in the story. There's no internal evidence for any author. Right? When you read Paul in Romans, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and the letter to the Romans.
Now the little letters.
Yeah, Romans 1:1 says, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. Oh, sounds like Paul's writing this. You know? It doesn't begin that way. Right? If you read Luke, it'll say, I, Luke, right? Theophanous, right? You tracking with me?
Mm-hmm.
Matthew, Mark, Luke. We could go if you wanted to. It's in Mark. It's in Luke. And then John will say that he's the beloved one who witnessed these things, writes these things down. It's at the end of the Gospel of John. But there's no internal evidence to any author. Traditional claims this book to be written by John Mark. You can find his name in Acts 12:25. He's associated with the early church. His mother was Mary. No, not that Mary. Right?
One of the other Marys.
One of the other Marys. And that's in Acts 12:12. Mark lacks a clear distinguishing demarcation for Palestinian geography. That means the author must not know a whole lot about the area, which helps us understand who this person is. It's important to note because we're going to run into that problem tonight. Remember, Mark's audience is probably not as fixated on the particulars as a modern audience. I'm going to say that again. It's a really important point. Oftentimes when we read the Bible, we read it as people stuck in 2023 because that's when we're reading it, right? So we say, there's no preface to this book. I don't know who published it. You know, all the questions we ask as modern people. What's the ISBN number? Right? They don't care. Those questions didn't exist. So, John. Let me start over. Yeah, John Mark is linked with Paul, Barnabas, and Peter in the story of Acts. He's associated with the early Christian cultural centers like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Rome. And that's about where our knowledge stops. So that's what we can say effectively about the author. Doing okay so far? Questions? Did I miss anything? When can we date Mark's writing? It is late enough to develop an oral tradition in the Christian movement. So what we mean by that statement is there are words in the text that seem to be creedal confessions. For example, let me give you an example. If I say, the Lord be with you, you might say,
Also with you.
now how do you know to say that? Right? You know it because it's been developed in our community. So when we read things in Mark that sound like they've been developed, it's because they probably have been. And so it's been around enough for an oral tradition to become part of the text. Okay? The consensus is that Mark was written between 65 and 75. And here are some highlights to Mark's life that are embedded in the text. One is there were a number of significant earthquakes in and around the Roman Empire, in particular in the year 60 and 63. We know that Rome was defeated in the west in 62 as they continued to expand. There was also a massive fire in Rome in 64. and the Christians were blamed for the burning of Rome. Fascinating Wikipedia article. Just, Google Rome fire 64, enter. Oh my gosh, right? The Christians were the scapegoats for the burning of Rome. We know that Emperor Nero committed suicide in 68, and after his suicide there was a massive fight for the throne, and there were 3 emperors who were sort of all within 1 year. It was a very tumultuous period. And then there was a war in Judea from 66 to 73. This is when, any big, massive history buffs with me? A couple? Okay. This is when the general Titus, I think, sieges Jerusalem in 70, like it's an undisputed fact. It is not like up for debate. In 70, the temple is destroyed. All of the contents of the temple, like the golden candlesticks, right? All the stuff that they would have worshipped and been involved in worship were taken, plundered. And there are carvings in Rome today of them bringing back the stuff from Jerusalem. And they're gone. It is a legend that the general slaughtered a pig and threw it into the temple. Right? Naughty, naughty. Unclean animal. So it was completely destroyed. So the temple in Jerusalem were sacked in 70. In Mark 13, Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple. So the question is, has this come to pass yet? Or does Mark understand it on the other side of the event, and he's writing about it and reflecting on it for the Christian community? And then, of course, the death of James and John are talked about and foretold in Mark 10. And the question is, has that happened yet? And is Mark reflecting on those deaths? It's also important to note that Peter and Paul are probably killed off as well when the Christians are blamed for the burning in 64. So we lose some of our apostles during that particular time.
Ark of the Covenant, was it in Jerusalem or was that?
I believe so. But it's a great question, and my history is failing me, but I believe so. I know that there is a picture, and you could find it, there's a bas relief of something called the Arch of Triumph in Rome, and there's a picture of Roman soldiers carrying like the menorah, like the candlesticks and everything. It's very Jewish in its carving, and it's clear as day that that's what they're marauding in, and it's to commemorate the sack of the temple and what they've taken from there. And I'm not sure if the Ark of the Covenant is carved into that arch or not. Good question. So that's when we date Mark based off some of those events. So you could say not a pleasant time in history, a lot of persecution going on in the church, and Mark is right in the midst of that. Helpful? Try to nail down some things, nail down who our author is. Probably John Mark. Not entirely sure who this individual is. There is a hint. It's funny. I think it's in Mark 14. There's a naked guy who runs away, and people are going to say, that's the author. It's like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. That's him in the story. It's there. I can't make this stuff up. So we know
Tell
who.
by his clothes.
Yeah, right now. We know who the author is. We know when he's writing, and we have some things to wrestle with around what text that we're using. I'll end with one last thing. You can do this later. If you are very interested, you can flip to the very beginning of your Bible, the stuff that we always skip over. And there's stuff in here, usually from the editor, about what, like the editor's preface, right? And you can read some of this, and it'll tell you what manuscripts they used in the translation of your text. Which is kind of neat. And then if you're a big nerd, you can oh, look, it's that manuscript. Then Google that manuscript name. And then it's just fascinating, And you can see all the things that might be up for debate in yours. Okay.
Were the manuscripts for this book together? Or,
Define together.
yeah, I mean, there had to be multiple documents.
Yes.
But were they together or were they scattered different places?
I think they were scattered. So, at no point in time do all the existing manuscripts come to Jerusalem and they sit down and compare notes. Is that what you're asking?
Well, yes, but so it could be the documents were written by different people.
Which documents?
Mark.
Yes.
Okay.
Could have been. However, we're going to go back to what we talked about earlier, too, is that the continuity of transmission, the clarity of capturing differences and carefully annotating different resources. So I'm gonna just, excuse me, I'm gonna walk up there. Footnotes here. I'm walking around. So, like in my Bible, and I don't know if some of you'll have this, it'll say other ancient authorities lack ancestors, right? Other ancient authorities read Gergesenes, others Gadarenes. So we're going to talk about that, and all those footnotes mean that there are other circulating manuscripts that read differently.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Hmm?
They should have checked the
Yeah,
handwriting.
right.
They should have. They should have. There's no punctuation. Mark forgot to put his name in the thing. Right.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking is the documents maybe all had a certain mark on them.
Oh, man.
Why'd you look at me?
That's worse than what I said.
So, no, that's really important to talk, to wrestle with, right? Like, again, just, to me that doesn't scare me, it's just something, it's humbling, right? To recognize that it's not always as clear cut as we think it is. My professors would say the truth is complicated. And so to say otherwise is to really dilute the truth.
However, there's all these wise men that have all these different manuscripts and little text here and little this there, and they, as a group, talked and
Yes.
and said, well, we're gonna put this one first and this one second.
Yep, and that's important, right? We built this thing, the Bible, by committee, by consensus, by comparing notes. That's what the Council of Nicaea sought to address a little bit of, even though it's primarily around heresy and the divinity of Christ. So these early church councils that meet together, they're around these very issues. And it is fascinating to read it with that perspective, to say, how did we get this thing? And the answer is carefully. Carefully. Okay, I'm going to just hop into the text.
Yeah.
Doing okay? Doing good? All right. We're going to do something a little bit different tonight. Because we got to, you know what I mean? We're going to begin with previously on Mark, and then we're going to hop into the section. We'll read a section. I got one more explanation thing around Mark 5:1, and then we're going to read a chunk, and I'm going to ask you a question. What do you see? Hopefully we've been training our eyes to dig into this a little bit. So I'm going to ask you, what do you see? And then we're going to go to the next slide where I've highlighted some things that I see. Maybe there'll be some overlap, and that's what we'll do for the night.
Those were
We'll
those
walk
hidden
through.
pictures like in my
That's right, yeah, the magic eye. All right, so previously on Mark 4:41, and they were filled with awe, the disciples, right, on the boat, in the lake. Jesus calms the storm, and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and sea obey him? There they are. They are on Lake Gennesaret, the Sea of Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee. And Mark 5:1 says, they came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. Already a problem with that is that there is no area actually called Gerasenes.
But there's Essenes.
There are some places that sort of sound like it, like Gadara. Maybe this area was known as Gerasenes, so I've put up some options for where we are. We are probably on the east side of the sea because Jesus goes to the other side, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're over there.
Yeah.
And we know that Jesus is going to be involved with the tomb. We know that he's going to be involved with some Roman people, so he's probably outside of Nazareth and Capernaum. Otherwise, Mark seems to be familiar with those areas, might say so. So I have four options for your consideration. The first option is Mark is unfamiliar with the area. He just doesn't know it, right? So he can't label it clearly. The second one is the name has been lost to time. We've seen this in other places, right? Again, I'll go all the way back to our study on Jonah. For the longest time, people thought Nineveh did not exist. They thought it was just gone. And then they found it, and everyone had to go eat crow and say, I guess we were wrong. Nineveh does exist. So maybe we haven't found Gerasenes yet, and we'll find it in 10 years.
There's a place down there called Garrison or something.
Right, see it down
Yep.
Near by that river.
there? Right.
Right here?
No,
No,
on
no.
down.
No.
Oh,
Over
to the right, to
Over
your
the
right.
Yeah.
Down,
Right
right
here.
there. Garrison.
Right,
Well, the problem with that is that ain't on the lake.
right.
Maybe
Okay.
it was.
Maybe it was. Maybe they walked all that way. I'm not being difficult,
Right.
right?
Okay, in this version,
Uh-huh.
King James, it's Gadarenes.
Okay, and this goes
Yeah,
to
yeah.
the very. I'm gonna go back. This goes back to this. So, someone's text said that word. Someone's text. Does anyone have a different word there? What do we have? We have gather.
Yeah, this is King James, this is the old version, so it's Gadarenes, so that would be Gadara. Right there.
Yep, that'd be right here, this area.
Maybe right
Yep.
there. Yeah.
So everyone will agree that Jesus is in an area called the Decapolis, the area of 10 towns, right? That's where he's at. The particularness has been lost, though. So I'm not trying to be difficult, I'm trying to be precise. So I also said the third option is maybe it's called something else to them. You know what I mean? Like the name has changed. We've talked about this. It's Indy, it's Indianapolis, it's Naptown, it's Circle City. It's all those things, right? In 50 years, someone's going to go, what do you call it? You know?
Yeah.
Maybe they'll rename it to Indianaville.
They're gonna say, what does Hoosier mean?
Right, yeah. So maybe it's called something else in this time. And we have a different tradition.
I have, on my footnote here, it says on 5:1, the other side of the sea refers to the eastern shore of Lake Galilee. The ruins of a village named Cursa are there.
I believe you.
Mine goes into a little bit more detail than that one. It says the east side of the lake, a territory largely inhabited by Gentiles, as indicated by the presence of the large herd of pigs.
Yep.
And then it says region of the Garrison. How do you say that? Gerasenes?
Gerasenes?
It says Gerasa, located about 35 miles southeast of the Sea of Galilee, may have had holdings on the eastern shore of the sea, giving its name to a small village there now known as Cursa, K-H-E-R-S-A.
Yeah.
About 1 mile south is a fairly steep slope within 40 yards of the shore, and about 2 miles from there are cavern tombs that appear to have been used as dwellings.
Do you all hear the difficulty? I think it's just important to point out, right? That there are different words for this area. And obviously it doesn't change the fact that Jesus is Lord, right? It doesn't change the fact that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead and appeared to his disciples and commissioned us to go start the church. But it's important to wrestle with. So, that we have some ideas on where it might be. We know it's probably in Gentile area, and that's where we are. Just wanted to point it out. We are over here, we are over here in this area of the 10 towns, the Decapolis. We are on the east side of the sea. And I think everyone would agree that it's probably Gentile territory. Doing good?
Well, yeah, there's a group of pigs there. that's for
There
sure.
is. It's a great story. I'm going to read. So I want you to look. So I'm going to ask you when I'm done reading. I ain't got nothing else except for another slide with this and some orange highlights that says, what do you see? That's it.
Right.
So I'm going to ask you, what do you see? Here we go. Mark 5, 2 through 13. And when he stepped out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces. And no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the region. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine. And the herd, numbering about 2,000,
Ooh.
stampeded down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. As promised. What do you see?
I'm curious, when it says, he's talking about my name is Legion and we are many. So does that mean there are many who are afflicted like him? Or just
No, it
him?
means many, he has many devils.
Yeah, so there's some people will say there's a play on words here, right? Like legionnaires and legion of the Roman army, but I think it was even saying that there are many within him.
Demons within
Yeah,
him.
so he has multiple possessions,
Okay.
or multiple unclean spirits that are within this individual.
But yet he knew who Jesus was, even though he had been, away from people. And
Yeah,
that's interesting.
it is interesting. So let's just play with that and what is interesting about it, based off what we've read so
I
far.
don't think the man knew Jesus, but the demons knew Jesus.
Okay.
So the guy didn't know,
Oh.
I mean, the
Right.
guy had nothing, well, I won't say had nothing to do with it, but the people addressing Jesus, it wasn't really the guy, it was the demons within him.
Yeah. So this idea, this question here says, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." This idea, "What do you have to do with me?" Is like, does anyone have a different translation of that phrase?
What do you want with me?
What do you want with me? Some versions will translate it like, "What do you have to do with me?" or "Do you have anything to do with me?" And it has the idea that like they serve different masters. Like, you're not my boss. I serve a different manager here, It's an interesting idea. And I think you're right that the demon seems to know who Jesus is, which is an ongoing motif in Mark. Right? Remember the other demons?
In the first and I think first and second,
You're-
same thing.
Yes.
They knew who he was.
Yeah. They know his name, they know his title, they're clear. And so this is also further evidence that Mark is building. Like, who is this Jesus person? The demons know who he is. The disciples still on the struggle bus. Right? Still trying to figure it all out. What else do you see?
Well, one of the commentaries said that back in those times, if you said to a person, you named their name and called them by title, you were potentially in control of them.
You have dominion over them.
Yeah, had dominion over them. And so they said this thinking maybe they would be able to control Jesus, but they couldn't because of who he was.
Yeah. And this happens earlier. We don't have to chapter and verse it, but there is this idea of name calling, and it is about dominion, having control over somebody. And so it's a great observation that they know, but Jesus doesn't know this one's name, which is interesting. So Jesus says in verse 9, "What is your name?" Right? And then he has to tell him, and then he has no authority over Jesus. Jesus continues to have authority over this individual, or individuals, if you want to be that specific.
Over the devil.
Over the devil. And there still is a spiritual warfare element going on. What else do you see in this passage, this section? Right?
They wanted someplace to go.
Who's they?
The demons or legion or whatever, whoever was in him did not want to be separated from something.
Yes.
And each other.
Yeah, it says the region. Don't send us out of the area.
Yeah.
Don't send us out of this region, which I think is interesting. So, and where did they elect to go?
Into the pigs.
Into the pigs. So, let's not miss this, right? That is an unclean animal. Okay? You're not allowed to touch them. They're an unclean animal. So if any of Jesus' disciples touch the pigs, right, they're ceremonially unclean. They are not allowed to attend synagogue. They have to be apart from the community. What else is, let's play with this, right? Clean and unclean. What else is unclean in this whole entire passage of the section?
They were unfit to eat too.
Sorry?
They were unfit to eat.
They were unfit to eat. What else? Where are they?
They're in the in the crazy house.
They're in the tombs.
Oh, they're-
Cemetery.
Oh, that's right. Oh,
Yeah, this is not a clean place to be.
Oh, okay.
This is also ceremonially uncleanliness. Unclean. Right? So we got the uncleanliness of the pigs. You have the uncleanliness of the tombs. You have the uncleanliness of a demon possession. So this is paralleling up to some other things that have already happened. Where else have we encountered cleanliness or uncleanliness in the Gospel of Mark so far? Do we remember?
Clean would be water, right? Why do you go to the water and drown?
Well, yeah, so that is the element of the purity of the water there. I'm talking about other demon possession or other uncleanliness.
The leper?
The leper, right? So this
Oh,
is,
yeah.
yeah, and the leper story is also paired with an exorcism. Okay, so here is, again, this motif of unclean, and clean. So these are going to be ancient themes that we sometimes have a hard time wrapping our mind around. There are some other things about like shame and honor, patronage and recipients, things that the ancient world, they knew. We'll get there when we get there. But this clean and unclean, this is always in the background of the text. So pay attention to that. Because Jesus is in the middle of a very unclean space. I don't mean that like it needs mopped. You know, I mean like it is ceremonially damaging to him. No Pharisee in their right mind would ever be caught in a graveyard with pigs and a demon-possessed person. Right? And here is this rabbi teacher who is in the middle of a cemetery with a demon-possessed man and a huge swineherd, right? Okay, good. Do you see anything else?
Well, somebody had been with him because they had chained him.
Yes, multiple times,
multiple
right?
times.
So what do you notice about that? There's some stuff here that I think is really interesting. I think Mark wants us to hear it.
Probably people around there were afraid of him and they chained him to protect themselves.
Okay, yeah. And what do you notice about the interplay between Jesus and this person who was chained? Hear the words, right? Excuse me. It says, he lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. So who now, right, can restrain him? The Lord. It's Jesus.
Right.
The answer is Jesus. This is like the Sunday school answer.
Right.
You know, but Mark's saying, no one could help this man. We tried. We chained him down, right? So he wouldn't hurt himself. He's hitting himself with stones. He's out of his mind. He's possessed. He has to live away from society. No one has dominion or authority over him except Jesus. Okay, I think so. I just captured a couple things, right? The idea of the unclean spirit, talking about spirits, and then the tombs and living in the unclean area. No one could restrain him anymore. Well, Jesus is gonna, right? No one had the strength to subdue him. Well, Jesus will, right? He noticed that the man runs and bows down before him. This idea of like, don't kill me. You know, like, I surrender. Jesus has full authority here. Then he notices his correct title, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. Again, when Jesus talks about himself, he uses the title Son of Man. But when the demons call him Son of God, so they got it right. Right? And then what is your name? This idea of dominion and authority over them. If I can get your name right, then I control and I have power over you. His name is Legion, which means many. And then the idea of the swine, and there's about 2,000 of them. All right. Woo! Doing good? Next section. All right. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the man possessed by demons sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they became frightened. Those who had seen what had happened to the man possessed by demons and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. Don't miss it, right? As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your own people, and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis, now we know where we are, and how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. What do you see?
Transformation.
of the man.
Yeah.
You could even argue transformation of this community.
Witness.
And you can tell he's with the Gentiles because he tells him to go home and blab it around. When he's with the Jews, he says, be quiet.
So be quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good point, Sharon.
It's a wonderful contrast that Mark is using. There's a different message for the Gentiles than there seems to be for the Jewish people.
Well, the man was afraid to be let go because I think he thought he might have a relapse.
Okay, yeah.
So
No, really.
you-
If I stay close enough to you,
Yeah.
you're my doctor, right? Like, you can guide me, you can heal me, and Jesus is the great physician, right? You can guide me, you can heal me, and if you're telling me to go away, I'm not sure I trust myself, or I'm not sure it's going to work out. What else?
Well, the people wanted him to leave, obviously, because that would be an economic hardship if you lost
Thank you. Yes.
that many swine. And
Yes.
that was your
They
livelihood.
screw up. Jesus screws up their economy. Over 2,000 pigs died.
Oh.
If you think that is a small amount of chump change, you are wrong. Right? What are they going to eat? What are they going to sell? Jesus just tanked the stock market. How dare he? And so they politely ask him to leave. We don't want you here. That's interesting.
Yeah. There's more to it than that, though, I think.
I think so.
There's more to it than that. I mean, they're afraid for
They
other
are.
reasons. You know, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly why, but the fact that he did this goes against everything they've seen or
Yes.
known. It's like, whoa, this is scary stuff. And this guy could be trouble. I mean, you know.
Yes. No, you're exactly. They are frightened, right? He clearly has more power than they do. They've tried the chain method. That didn't work out. Right? We shackled him. That didn't work out. How is Timmy now okay? They're terrified. He also just drowned 2,000 pigs in one fell swoop. He doesn't seem to be too bothered by that because this dude is now being told to go tell them what mercy God has given him. And they're not sure what to do with it either. You can almost see and hear. But can you go away? I don't know what to do with you. Can you just leave me like I was?
In our society, he'd be shot.
Oh yeah. Well, and are you ready? And in this society, he gets crucified.
Well, that's true. But
Yeah.
But at the moment, he would probably.
Well, that's right, yeah.
It would be immediate more.
So I think you're right. There's something going on here, and they are not sure what to do with this man. Woo! It's getting good. All right. I'm gonna keep moving on. We're doing good. So talk about the man who's sitting there. He's clothed in his right mind. This is the same guy, and they are frightened. I think that frightened, that is a motif in Mark. It'll happen again and again. They are frightened. At the very end of Mark chapter 15, the women who encounter the empty tomb, Mark says they run away. They tell nobody because they are frightened. They are scared. Woo! When you encounter the power of God, if it doesn't put the fear of the Lord in you.
People are still afraid of what they don't know.
Yeah, we are
Yes.
terrified of what we don't understand.
Yeah.
Right? So they beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. Jesus, can you please go away before you kill the other half of my herd? Right? Leave. And then I love what Jesus says to him. It says, go and tell what mercy God has shown you. The idea of mercy in the ancient world is something that you don't deserve, right? We talked about the Ark of the Covenant earlier. The angels that are on top of the Ark of the Covenant and the wings that fold inward, that's called the mercy seat. The mercy seat is believed where God would sit and give out mercy to the people. So go tell what mercy God has shown you. And then he went away and he begins to proclaim in the Decapolis. You'll notice that this is a Gentile who goes away and becomes an evangelist for Jesus. And the disciples still aren't sure who this man is. But here's someone who has been healed and touched by God, and they go away and they become an evangelist. Doing okay? Checking in? All right. Mark 5:21 through 24. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, pause. right? It's unclear, but we know he's crossing again. So where is he?
Back on
He's
the
down
west.
by the west side.
Headed to the west.
Maybe, or yeah, he's north, south, but we're in the Sea of Galilee, that area, right? So he's back on the boat, back on the lake. So when Jesus crossed again the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, so we're around Jewish folk. So where there's a synagogue, there's got to be Jewish folk. Named Jairus came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and pleaded with him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. What do you see?
Resurrection.
Resurrection. This is a story about that. Faith. Yes. What else do you see?
Trust.
From whom?
From the dad. I forget whether you said his name was Jairus or Darius.
Yeah,
Jairus.
or Jairus. Yeah.
Yours.
Well, he also felt that Jesus needed to touch her.
Okay. Yeah.
He couldn't say, "Hey, Jesus, heal my daughter, she's over in the other town. Just do it from here and we'll be fine." He wanted him to go with him to do it in person and put his hands on her.
Yeah. And so this is also a tradition in the church, right? The presence of both the presence of God, the presence of Christ, and two, like when we ordain people, the bishop put their hands on me, like there was no virtual ordination. Ain't gonna happen. There is no virtual communion. Ain't gonna happen, right? It's about the presence. And it's seen here as well. This week, Jesus, come with me. What else do you see?
These people aren't afraid of him.
Okay, they're not.
No.
So we know that they're familiar with him, perhaps, or they have faith that he's not going to murder all their swine,
They don't have any.
Faith that he's going to heal her.
Okay, so let's just think of it. We've read 4 chapters of Mark so far. So who's the character?
Jairus.
Jairus, and who is he?
A Jew.
Okay. In particular, what's his role and function?
Leader of the synagogue.
He's a leader of the synagogue. What are the first 4 chapters telling us about Jesus and his reputation in the synagogue?
They don't like him.
They don't like him.
They don't want
They've
him.
gotten into arguments. They've had church fights already, right? They formed a committee and said, "We don't want that Jesus guy around here."
Yes, but wanting to save your child.
Oh, come on now. Come on now. Some people are having a change of heart.
Uh-huh.
They're having a change of heart. Or
What does he have to
maybe,
lose?
okay, well, yeah,
Or
right.
maybe he secretly has faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just remember the 2 old guys that took Jesus' body. It's Nicodemus and the other one. The whole body in the synagogue, all the big shots, they didn't know
Right.
that they had secret faith.
Yes. So it is debated over who in the synagogue is believing that he's the Messiah, hook, line, and sinker, who has doubts, and who is outright opposing him. And it's clear here that Jairus, he's a leader of the synagogue. So we know he's not a small fry, right? He's a leader of the synagogue. He is either desperate, or he has faith, or both.
Okay, can you define, okay, I didn't understand exactly. He wasn't a Sadducee, he wasn't a Pharisee, he wasn't
He wasn't a scribe, otherwise it would probably say that.
So what is the definition of leader? What was his position?
I don't know. I'm gonna assume that he's probably a male elder.
I was gonna say he's like Evan Springer.
So we know we talked about this with the example with Ruth, right? They need to gather the elders of the town, and they form like a legal council. So he has legal standing, he has a name, because there are other people nod your head in the Bible who don't get named, right? The woman with the issue of blood, she ain't got no name, right? She's coming
He's
up.
probably married somebody.
Right. So he's named, so he probably has legal standing. He's probably an important community pillar sort of guy. Doing okay?
Well, and it also says he went with him. So
Yeah.
could he have done that, knowing that he is part of the synagogue, and say, "Hey, I'm doing this for one of the people that is involved with the synagogue, and many of those people will persecute me, but obviously some of those people won't.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I want to move on because I think what happens with the story is we get interrupted. So what happens is Jairus says, "Will you come heal my daughter?" Jesus says, "Yes, I will." He takes one step, another story happens, and then the story picks up on the back end. So I wanted to point out, right, we were talking about he crossed again, so we know he's back in the boat. Notice a great crowd gathered. This is a motif in Mark, right? Bunch of people gather. Jesus gets a little overwhelmed. Jesus retreats to the wilderness or to a lonely place. Something happens teaching with the disciples. Public ministry, retreat. Public ministry, retreat. In seminary, they train us. Model your ministry as a pastor after Jesus. On Mondays, you cannot find me. I do not come in here. I'm done with you people, right? I'm at home, reading, writing, studying. I'm in my basement. You ring my doorbell, I ain't answering that door, on Friday. You can't find me. I have to prepare for Sunday morning, right? So Jesus, he does these public displays, and then he retreats. And then he does the public display, and he retreats. So the great crowd's there. Leader of the synagogue, and he pleads with him. He's desperate. He also probably has faith. We're going to get there. The story's interrupted. And a large crowd followed him, because there was a large crowd, and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. Healthcare hasn't changed a whole lot. I'm just kidding. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. And she said, "If I but touch his cloak, I'll be made well." Immediately her flow of blood stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my cloak?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say who touched me?" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." What do you see?
It's another unclean.
Yes.
She's unclean.
Good eyes. Absolutely. Right? Another story about an unclean thing going on. She's unclean. She's unable to join the community because of her issue of blood. It's not stated exactly what it is. Does she have hemophilia? I don't know. They don't know what that is. Right? Is this an issue with her period and her flow? I don't know. It doesn't say so. She has some sort of issue of blood.
She's going through the change.
Yeah. Well, and you also notice that the years are given, right? So it's been going on for 12 years. Hear that word. We talked about this. It's a number. It doesn't say 11 years. It doesn't say it's 12. Right? That means a whole time, a long time, a complete time. She might have always had this issue.
How old was the girl?
How old was what?
Was the girl?
Well, we'll get there. We'll get there.
I thought she was 12.
I think she's 12. These stories are related. Okay. What else? What else do you see?
I think it's interesting that it says that power had gone forth from him.
Yeah.
So it seems like whenever this happens, it's like, whoo, that took a lot.
Yes.
So they need to regroup again.
Yes. Yeah. Which, and Jesus is tired, right? He gets in the boats when he's asleep. It does seem that, like, his healing manifests physically. Both somehow it costs, it is exhausting, or it's something, and then clearly something physically happens to the recipients of his power. I just think it's not a metaphor. Like the blind people see, right? The woman with the issue of blood, it stops. It's not like she's like, "Oh, I'm metaphorically and spiritually whole. Now I can go back to temple." Like, no, she is physically changed. Okay, it's good eyes.
Isn't this the only place in the Bible that talks about Jesus feeling different after he has done something like this?
I think so. Now that you say that, the correct answer is I'm going to say I don't know, but I believe so. I can't think of any other example in the Gospels where yeah.
Well, in that series on TV,
The chosen?
The chosen. Okay, during part of that, he is healing all these people. And at the end of that, he comes in and he says, I'm just so totally worn out.
Yeah.
I mean, it took all that out of him to heal those people. And it leads you to believe this kind of thing happened. That to do that took more out of him than just putting his hands on people.
Yes. Yeah. It's
And
powerful.
I always think it's interesting that she, like Jairus thinks Jesus has to touch.
Yeah.
She's like, if I could just touch his clothes.
Yeah.
Yeah, not him.
Yeah, later on, I don't know whether it's in Mark or some other one, but Jesus heals somebody without going. He
Right.
says,
He does. He says, "Go, your faith."
Right.
Yeah, it made them well. Yeah, and he says like you'll find that she's healed, and that story is also I think of a Roman official. I think.
Yeah.
But wasn't it also in that era that it was known that if out of respect to touch the cloak of their kings in that era?
Yeah, there's this other, I don't want to say tradition, that there's something to do with the garment that they're wearing and the hem of the garment, and there are other allusions in scripture to the hem of the garment having a particular power as well. You'll also notice that, again, the clean and unclean, we talked about that a little bit earlier. If she touches him, he's unclean. So, every first century Jew who reads it says, oh yeah, of course, I'm just saying it out loud. Sometimes we miss that. I'm going to just punch through here a little bit. So, large crowd, blood, cleanliness, uncleanness, 12 years, that whole season time. She said she spent all she had. She was no better, but rather grew worse. My joke, right? Healthcare hasn't gotten much better. So immediately, this is Mark's favorite word. Like immediately, right? Flow of blood is stopped. Power going forth from Jesus. This again, don't miss this fear and trembling. The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. I mean, if you touched somebody and you were healed, you name it. You could see the blood stopped, the cancer was gone, you could walk. You would be moved, right? You would be at a loss for words. So she goes and she tells Jesus everything, right? Confession is good for the soul. And then notice it's not condemnation from Christ, right? Daughter, your faith has made you well. And this, we talked about this a little bit, it's her faith that has made her well. She believed. Contrast this story, we'll see it later, right, with the faith of the disciples.
Yeah.
Right? We know the stories. Peter tries to walk on water, sinks. Jesus says, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? There's other stories in that regard.
Yeah, the storm comes up. Why are you fearing?
Why are you afraid?
And Jairus maybe didn't have faith.
Okay, so where is Jairus in the story?
He's on hold.
He's on hold.
Hold on.
So I'm not going to preach a whole lot, but this is a truth that has been told to me in this story. I think it is. So Jesus is going to work. His 9 to 5 right now involves a meeting with Jairus. And what happens to his schedule? He gets interrupted. Can you imagine if Jesus said, sorry, I don't have time for you. I have a prior commitment. Right? And the way this has been preached to me and taught is that you will be interrupted in your life. Do not miss those interruptions. They are powerful moments of transformation. So be aware of that. Jesus is walking, he's interrupted. He could have just said, guys, I have to go. Someone's dying. I have to go to the hospital. I have to go visit my aunt. Whatever it is, I gotta go. Don't get out of the way. Instead, they're gathering around him. He can barely move through them. This woman touches him. A whole entire other miracle happens. A miracle happens. He's on his way to perform a miracle. Then a miracle happens. Part 2. While he was still speaking, go daughter, your faith has made you well. Some people came from the synagogue leader's house to say, your daughter's dead. If only Jesus had been there, right? He's busy healing this other woman. How dare he? She's dead. Go back. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the synagogue leader, "Do not be afraid,
She's only asleep.
only believe." It says, "Do not be afraid, only believe." Now, I'm going to ask you what you see, but pay attention, right? Or we should use Mark words. If you have ears, hear. So do not be afraid, only believe. He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, who was the brother of Jesus. When they came to the synagogue leader's house, he saw the commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. What do you see?
Magic 12.
Yeah, and the number 12 again, right? These are parallel in the Gospel of Mark. You have the woman with the issue of blood for 12 years. You have this small girl who's 12. These stories are tied together. What else?
When she wakes up, she eats. And when Christ wakes up, he eats.
Yeah. So the idea of a joint meal together is a motif in Christian community. Yes?
Saying like, don't tell anyone.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so again, we hear this messianic secret. So I'm just going to ask a question, and I think I've done it before, we just have to wrestle with this some more. Why does Jesus keep telling them not to say anything?
So that they will.
But then why does he tell the other person to say something?
So he won't.
Because he deals with the Jews and the Gentiles differently.
Yeah.
That's right,
The
that's right.
Jews
Yeah.
are not going to be happy about any of this. The Gentiles are saying, "Hey, go for it," But they're not involved with the temple, and the Jews are not going to like any of this.
Yeah.
Perhaps he's afraid that if he pushes with the Jews too much, his ministry will get cut shorter.
Maybe. Yeah.
They do away with him before he's ready to go.
So we've talked about it, I know we have, but if you take Mark 1, 2, 3, 4, and now 5, and if you were to encapsulate who this Jesus person is, right, you would say he's a miracle worker.
He's the Son of the Most High.
Well, the demons say that, yeah. You would say that he exorcises demons. He's got some weird teachings. They call them parables. He's a healer. He can bring the dead back from the life.
I read, I think it was in Max Lucado's book, that Jesus ruined every funeral he ever went to.
That's funny. Yeah. Yeah, because they're already beginning the mourning process here. Okay, so what else do you see? Let's keep going. I know we're over. I apologize. It's too good to stop. We'll wrap up in a few minutes. What else do you see? I had a few. What do
you want us to see?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. All right, let's see. This is some things that I saw.
Okay.
We'll go back.
The people around laughed at him.
Yeah.
And ridiculed him and said, "Hey, too late, buddy. She's gone, and you got her here late." And so they mocked him.
Yeah. And don't lose that. Like, I talked about this at Good Friday. It's things that we don't like to talk about. That Jesus was scorned, mocked, ridiculed. Right? I'm going to say some hard words. We are promised the same thing.
Yep.
So there would be times when people look at you and say, "What you believe is crazy." They make fun of him. And notice too, he doesn't turn around and say, "Well, who's laughing now?" Like he doesn't. He doesn't. He says, "Don't say anything." It's not even taking the moral high road. He's not like, "See, I got him. My teachings are the best. He doesn't do that. He goes in, he heals the afflicted, and then he says, don't say anything.
And he didn't let all of them see it.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, he got them out and
That's-
just took the mother and father and the apostles.
Okay, and there's 3 apostles listed, right? Peter, James, and John. And then you guys have heard my joke, right? These are the 3 that get to go on all the field trips
That's right.
with Jesus. Peter, James, and John. These are the ones who are at the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew where the heavens are torn apart. They are there. They get to see that. What about the other 9? They're probably back at camp, you know, getting s'mores ready. You know? And they come back, Peter, what happened? And Peter, can you imagine trying to tell the story? I'm almost preaching, but you know, can you imagine trying to tell the story? They come back and then they go, so what happened? She dead? And then Peter's like, well, like she was. Jesus says she was sleeping. Now she's awake. And they're like, awake? Like in heaven with her family? Like, no, like she's alive. And then they're like, okay. So Peter, James, and John. You'll notice Jesus' words to the synagogue leader, to Jairus, right? Do not be afraid. Only believe. Peter, James, and John are there. In verse 40, you have the mocking laughter. I think it is mocking. I think it's laughter. Because Jesus says the child's not dead. She's sleeping. And then notice who goes with them, right? The father and the mother, those who are with him. They go in to see where the child is. You'll notice he says Talitha Kum. I believe that's Aramaic. So Jesus is speaking like the heart language of these people. He speaks to them like in a way that is a regional dialect. That's the best way to say it, right? Immediately, that's Mark's word, right? The girl stood up, and she's 12.
You're right, Josh, that is Arabic.
Is it Aramaic?
Yes. One of the languages of Palestine.
And that is Mark chapter 5. Woo!
Whoa, beautiful.
Woo!
Yeah.
Other thoughts? I apologize for going over, but I wanted to make sure we covered our ground.
I think nowadays a lot of people, young people, do recognize that there is no God, and we don't need God.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, very definitely.
And I think sometimes people.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
How does Jesus expect people to explain, you know, the little girl coming, you know, being in school the next day, you know, or people that, you know, weren't able to walk, get up and walk, but don't say anything? I mean, what is the expectation of Jesus to answer that? You know, well, how come Mary Lou's in school? I thought they had to wait for her.
Yeah. So the answer for the demoniac, right, the guy with the legion, Jesus says, go tell them what mercy God has shown you. Like, that's his expectation of that healing. Where the other ones is he expects them not to say anything, which is then how are they supposed to explain it? You could argue that they're supposed to say, I don't know. I know that I was blind, but now I see. I know that I couldn't walk, but now I can.
I was bleeding.
I know that I was bleeding, but now I'm not bleeding. It's almost as if there is not an explanation.
Really?
Like it is one, say, of like awe, fear, and trembling, and grace and mercy.
They're supposed to lie to the, you know, they saw or they felt or they, you know, they know that Jesus was there. They touched his clothing. You know, they were healed. So there's the expectation is to lie when somebody says, well, hey, I thought you were sick.
So, 2 minutes.
Okay.
There are people, oh gosh, I kicked over my camera. Okay, there are people that are going to say the reason why Jesus is telling them not to say anything is because he has not fully revealed who he is. And if they go right now and just say, this dude healed me, Jesus is a cosmic Santa Claus, right? He is the one who performs all these miracles. That's not the whole story. We know the whole story, right? We know that Jesus is not just some guy who will heal you. Sometimes healing doesn't happen. Sometimes the journey of following Jesus involves great sacrifice. Ultimately, it will involve his death. And that whole part of the equation has not entered into Jesus' ministry yet. So when they say, who is this man? They think he's a healer. He's a miracle worker. And then we talked about Mark chapter 8, which is the big pinnacle of this discussion. Who is this man? Peter will say, we think you're the Christ. Well, what does Peter mean by that? And this is why Jesus is telling them, don't say anything, because you don't know who I am yet. You think I just heal you. But my ministry is far more encompassing than just me healing you physically.
Thank you.
Maybe. Yeah. Well, we'll see if it's compelling. We'll talk about it more if we discover it. Okay, I'll linger for a little bit, but I'm going to end the stream. Thank you for your patience and your grace and going over a little bit tonight. It's not like me. I preach short. I teach about an hour there. And, got me excited. So I appreciate your grace. Let's end with a word of prayer, and then I'll linger. God, again, we give you thanks for this book and being able to work through it tonight. God, I give thanks for each and every one of these individuals here and those online. Pray that you'd bring us rest this evening, healing, and wholeness in your mercy. Amen.
Thank you, John.